Debate.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak to a Conservative motion that is not what it pretends to be, presented by a Conservative leader who's not who he says he is. And what I mean by that, Mr. Speaker, is that this motion pretends to be an analysis of the causes of inflation in Canada, except that it only includes one factor, which is government spending and government deficits. And yes, there is a deficit. Yes, there has been government spending. Yes, some of that may have contributed in some ways to inflation, but it's far from the whole story, Mr. Speaker. Canada has had deficits at the federal level in periods where there has not been inflation. In fact, or at least not inflation of the significant type that we're living today, inflation within the target zone. The 7 consecutive deficits, large deficits that the Harper Conservatives ran when they were in power did not coincide with the kind of significant inflation that we've seen. So obviously there are other factors at work here, and I think it's dishonest to pretend that only government deficit is what's driving inflation, or even that it's the major factor in what's driving inflation. Obviously, there are supply chain constraints that arose through the pandemic, a reordering of purchasing first towards goods and then back towards services. There are a number of strictly market forces that we could talk about. And among those as well, and chief among those, is the role that corporate greed plays. And I think it's a glaring deficiency of this motion, and not just this motion, but the Conservatives' analysis generally, that they don't talk at all about the role that corporate greed has been playing in fueling inflation. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we look at corporate profits, for instance, in the grocery sector, we've seen at the very same time that Canadians are struggling, and we're hearing more and more about Canadians having to choose between paying for rent and paying for groceries, massive increases in the profit margins of Canada's largest grocery retailers. That's not a function of them simply passing on costs from the carbon tax or supply chains or whatever else to their consumers, because if they were just passing on the cost, their profits wouldn't be increasing, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is that the profit is going up because they're charging Canadians more than the additional costs that they're facing right now. And so that's important to talk about. I would say, Mr. Speaker, that when it comes to the Liberal government, corporate greed is just as much missing from their analysis of what's driving inflation as the Conservatives, and they are doing just as little about it, Mr. Speaker, which is certainly a frustration of us in the New Democratic Party. They call the big grocery retailers to Ottawa to give them a slap on the wrist, ask them to do better, ask them to stabilize, not reduce prices, but stabilize prices, i.e. consolidate the gains they've made by raising prices unfairly over the last number of years so that Canadians have to continue to pay that going forward, rather than talking about ways to try and make food more affordable than it currently is. But you can't look to the Conservatives for solutions on food prices because they've got nothing to say other than to reduce the carbon tax, as if those very same grocery retailers who have shown that they're quite happy to raise prices to eat up whatever extra disposable income Canadians get won't just turn around and do that very same thing. They're silent when it comes to corporate greed in the oil and gas sector that has been driving inflation for Canadians. When we talk about the role that energy costs play in driving inflation, it's important to note that the price increases on energy far exceed the increase in the carbon tax. And that's why from 2019 to 2022, oil and gas companies in Canada saw an increase in profits of 1,000%. Where's the analysis from the Conservatives on what that does to grocery prices? Mr. Speaker, if oil and gas companies are going to gouge the farmer that grows the food and gouge the processor that makes the food and gouge the trucker that ships the food, Canadians are going to get gouged at the grocery store, notwithstanding anything that happens in this place or the level of tax, because they're going to get gouged simply based on the outsized increases in oil and gas prices that oil and gas companies are using to pay larger dividends to their shareholders and bigger checks for their CEOs. So we have to talk about that if we're going to get real about the challenges that Canadians are facing. We have a Conservative Party who talks about very little else other than inflation, talks about the housing sector. Canadians are experiencing pain, but to pretend that somehow deficits derived from paying so that kids can get their teeth fixed are what's causing inflation in the housing market is either stupid or dishonest, Mr. Speaker. Because the fact of the matter is there is a ton of private capital in the Canadian real estate market, domestic capital, that is bidding against Canadians when they're trying to buy a family home in order to turn that house into a long-term investment. And that is a big part of the story of what's going on. So when Conservatives talk about how we need lower taxes, in spite of the fact that now 1% of Canadians own 25% of the wealth in this country, while fully 40% of Canadians have to live sharing only 1% of the wealth that's being created in this country. That 1% that owns the 25%, they're a big part of the problem in the housing market because they have a lot of extra cash that they didn't get from government, that they're investing back into the housing market to buy up more housing and make more money off the backs of Canadians that are already strapped. That's not to knock business, Mr. Speaker. Small and medium-sized businesses are an important driver of economic growth in this country. They're important employers. They help make the world go around. And there's a lot of room for legitimate business. And we know that a lot of small and medium enterprises are actually struggling right now. They're not the ones that are the problem. So let's not conflate our criticism of big corporations and big capital with the small business owner that's providing services in their community and trying to break even in a very difficult time. Right? So the other thing I heard earlier from a Conservative MP, well, don't go after the wage payer if you want to help the wage earner. Well, when we talk about the oil and gas industry, you know what happened the day after the Alberta election? A big oil and gas company laid off 1,500 workers, despite the fact they're extracting more oil than ever and making more money than ever. And the fact is that more and more employment in the oil and gas industry has been decoupled through technological advance and other things that do help with productivity growth from the employment of Canadians. And that oil and gas company timed the announcement of those layoffs in order to help their political friends in the Conservative Party in Alberta to spare them the embarrassment of bringing that fact to light during an election, Mr. Speaker. So that's why this motion is not what it pretends to be. And as I said earlier, it's been presented by a Conservative leader who is not who he pretends to be. He talks about the housing crisis. In fact, earlier in his speech on this very motion, took credit, named himself as the minister who was responsible for housing in the Harper government. The government that lost 800,000 affordable units during their tenure. The government that when operating grants to create affordable rents were set to expire because they were tied to 40 or 50-year mortgages signed in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s in order to make rent more affordable, took the decision not to continue providing that operating grant money, but to let it drop. And that's why we're seeing places like Lions Matter on Portage Avenue in Winnipeg get sold off, because without the operating subsidy, they can't continue to provide the deeply affordable units that they were providing. So what happened there? A big corporate landlord swooped in. They're going to superficially renovate the building, kick out the existing tenants, and start charging a lot more rent for the people who can afford to move in. And I don't begrudge those folks the housing, because we know that no matter where you are in the housing spectrum, there's a need. We don't have enough supply of any of those kinds of housing. So I won't begrudge Canadians taking the opportunity to find a home that they can afford, but it's no excuse for a government that isn't willing to do what it takes to make sure that those people who need those deeply affordable units have a place to go. And that's where we need a federal government that's willing to take responsibility for that. And I'm sorry, but we have not seen that from this government. We're not building enough deeply affordable and affordable units in this country. We're simply not. And if we leave it to the market, it'll never get done. As a developer, the Finance Committee said yesterday, we're never going to build affordable housing. It's not our job. Our job is to build housing that we can make a buck on and we're not going to make a buck if we undercharge on the rent. Well, we know that. That's why the federal government for decades made serious and repeated and regular predictable offerings in the social and affordable housing space for a generation. And it's why during that generation and for a little while after, we didn't have the kind of housing crisis that we currently have. The problem is that we have a government that is focused too much on simply effecting market solutions, the very market that let us down and the very market that says itself will not fix the problem. So you look to the Conservatives, how are they different? Well, they're not, because they too only offer solutions that are predicated upon the market. It's not that we don't also need market solutions. It's that if we focus too much and only on those market solutions, we're never going to get to where we need to be. So here we have a Conservative leader that wants to talk about housing, that wants to say he's got the answer, but just like this government is overly focused on market mechanisms instead of the kind of non-market housing that we need, that we used to have in the period that Canada was not facing this kind of housing crisis. And so he's not who he pretends to be. He's somebody who says he wants workers to have powerful paychecks. And I agree. I want workers to have powerful paychecks. That's why when workers are on strike, I'm out on the picket line with them, supporting them to bargain better wages and better working conditions and better health and safety standards in their workplace. Never ran into that guy on a picket line. Never seen a picture of him on a picket line. Never seen him support picketing workers with a tweet or a post or nothing. What I have watched him do is vote with the Liberal government on back-to-work legislation to prematurely end strikes on terms that are favorable to the employer, Mr. Speaker. So don't tell me that this guy's got workers' backs. We watched as he sat at the cabinet table and raised the age of retirement from 65 to 67, denying Canadian seniors their old age supplement for a further 2 years. Why? To keep them in the workforce. That's why. Well, that's not having the back of Canadian workers who worked their whole life in order to be able to enjoy their retirement. And anyone who's had a member of their family fall ill with cancer in their 60s knows how precious those 2 years can be and what a difference it can make in their life, in the life of their family, in benefiting from some of the things that they worked hard to build during their life. Those 2 years aren't nothing, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say, I mean, I've watched this Conservative leader, I think 3 Opposition Day motions in the last 5 months. He's put them all in he's put them in his name. He's given the lead speech for them. I watched on the special debate about the allegations that the government of India had killed a Canadian on Canadian soil as a result of their political beliefs and activity. I watched as the whole Conservative caucus, just about except for their House leader for 5 minutes, was silenced. I watched as a very intense protest and counter-protest on the rights of children to be safe and to make some of their own judgments about what's safe or not in their own home. I watched as the Conservative leader told his members not to go, not to speak, not to post. This is the apparent champion of freedom of speech, just not for his caucus, I guess, Mr. Speaker. So I watch as Conservative MPs rehash the same member statement over and over and over again, clearly formulated out of the talking points of their leader who says he wants people to say what they will. I want to know why, if the Conservative leader doesn't trust Conservative MPs to speak for him, why Canadians should trust Conservative MPs to speak for them in this place. I watched as the Conservative leader was a member of the Harper team who pioneered the electoral tactic of telling their candidates they're not allowed to go to local debates and speak their own mind and offer their own position. Perhaps he's worried that if they speak too much, they'll reveal that he is not who he says he is. I noticed earlier there was a Conservative MP, the MP for Tobique Mactaquac got up and said he's never supported a carbon tax. Never supported a carbon tax. Well, maybe if he had to read his platform in debate prep in the last election, he'd have noticed that there was a carbon price in that platform. Maybe that's why the Conservative leader doesn't want his MPs talking too much in this place or elsewhere, because they would expose the fact that what he's saying now is not what they've said in the past, and it's not what they'll do in the future. I heard him say, you can't support wage earners without supporting wage payers in respect of the oil and gas industry. And as I said earlier, actually, the wage payers in the oil and gas industry are making more money than they've ever made before, and they're laying off workers, Mr. Speaker. So I really don't think that is an example we can take to heart. This motion calls for a financial plan with a path back to a balanced budget. Fair enough. I don't think that's a bad thing. Perhaps we'll see something like that in the fall economic statement. I won't hold my breath. But after you listen to this guy talking about the incompetence of this government, and there are some very compelling arguments on that front. We may not make all the same arguments, but we certainly have our own. And then he wants Canadians to believe it's plausible for them to come up with a plan to balance the budget in a week's time. I mean, come on, it's not serious. It's not serious. And fundamentally, that Conservative leader is not serious. And this motion is not serious because it doesn't get to the bottom of what's driving inflation in Canada. It just singles out one thing that incidentally is to his electoral advantage to have people believe, and it leaves out all the ways that he will help the corporate players that are driving inflation in Canadians' household budgets, because he doesn't want Canadians thinking about that, because then they would know that those problems will persist. He likes to quote a former Liberal minister, John Manley, which is curious because we see him be very disparaging of anyone with any connection to the Liberal Party. I understand the impulse, but I find it passing strange that a longtime Conservative and strong public servant of this country, David Johnston, could have his character assassinated by the leader of the official opposition when he happened not to necessarily agree with everything that the Conservative leader thought, and then he's willing to turn around and hold up a former Liberal minister that, frankly, whose advice I never took very seriously, but now suddenly is an authority for the Conservative caucus. And I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, it is the surest sign of despotic tendencies in a political leader when they're willing to disparage and engage in character assassination, even their own folks that come out of their own political movement for the simple cry of disagreeing with the leader, and then hold up people that they would otherwise criticize as authorities when they agree with them. And to do that in a context where he's shown he's quite happy to silence his own people in order to make sure they don't expose some of the web that he is weaving and the wool that he's pulling over Canadians' eyes is another sure sign. Just like when it comes to the opportunity that my private member's motion offers for Conservatives to curtail the powers of the Prime Minister to unilaterally prorogue this place and dissolve this chamber to provide more political accountability for that, you would think the Conservative leader would be interested in putting some meaningful constraints on the gatekeeping powers of this Prime Minister, but actually not. They were the first out of the gate to say they wouldn't support that motion, and it's because this leader wants those powers for himself, not because he actually has an objection to the gatekeeping powers of the Prime Minister's office. And those are just some of the reasons why the Conservative leader is not who he says he is, just as this motion is not what it says it is, and it's why New Democrats will be voting against it.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Provencher.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I listened with great interest to the Honourable Member from Transcona-Elmwood, his speech, and he made a couple good points. How one, that you just can't trust this Liberal government to provide affordable housing, and I wouldn't agree with him more. And I'd like to give him the opportunity to expand on that a little bit more. How this government has reneged on their promise to look after the people that need their help.
For Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I think when you look at the National Housing Strategy, There's a lot of fanfare. There's some big numbers announced. I think one of the really important things to note at the beginning of the National Housing Strategy was that the big number that was announced was actually a multiplier that took for granted a bunch of provincial funding that had not been committed. And so the Liberals were taking credit for money that really hadn't even been announced except unilaterally by the federal government on behalf of the provinces, which is something they have no right to do. And so the National Housing Strategy has been a bit of a smokescreen from go. And yes, there are some units that have been built along the way, but they pale in comparison to what we need. And I think one of the compelling kind of proof points of that is Steve Pomeroy, who's a housing expert in Canada, has said that for every one affordable unit we're building in Canada today, we're losing 15. So how do you make up the ground that you have to make up in order to get people out of tent cities and back into homes if you're losing 15 units of affordable housing for every one that you're building? You can't do it. We're not even treading water in Canada today.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Well, Mr. Speaker, what my colleague just said is very interesting. About the affordable housing units we're losing in Canada. And that leads me to a less well-known issue in this area. The fact that increasingly large investment trusts, large holding companies are buying affordable housing. These multinationals are destroying them, renovating and doubling the price. That happens a lot. This type of thing didn't exist in the 90s, but now we see that 20 to 30% of our real estate is held by these large multinationals. But the government isn't doing much to end this. If we're trying to build those 3 million units, it's not just going to happen by magic. We need to take strong measures, and I'd like to hear from my colleague on that, and do something about the financialization of the housing sector. The Honourable Member. Thank you very much for the question. And I would like to answer by saying that there are two aspects to the lack of federal action on this. Two phases. In the 90s, first of all, the Liberals canceled the housing strategy. And then later, under the Harper government, operational funds were linked to mortgages for affordable housing, but they decided not to renew that money. Once the mortgages matured, and so we saw large corporations starting to buy these units. Because they could no longer offer affordable rentals. So big multinationals would buy those buildings, and then they would hike the prices for the rentals. It would be really useful to have a fund where nonprofits can use the money to acquire housing to ensure that it's not just large corporations that have the resources to snap up those buildings, to ensure that others, organizations that have a commitment to affordability so that they can access these buildings and so that they can do more work in that area.
Deputy House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I listened with great interest to my colleague's speech, in particular when he was talking about how Conservatives are being muzzled by their leader. And he's absolutely right. You know, we saw a take-note debate occur in this House earlier in September, where we were discussing a Canadian citizen who had potentially may have been murdered by a foreign government, and Conservatives chose to be absolutely silent. Didn't stand up and give one speech other than their House Leader speaking for 5 minutes at the very beginning. Didn't ask a single question the whole time. Then we saw about a week later a protest going out on the streets in front of this building regarding the LGBTQ movement. And once again, Conservatives were told not to speak. As a matter of fact, a leaked email from their leadership told MPs not to make any comment on it whatsoever. What does that say to this member about the freedom, quote unquote, that the Leader of the Opposition purports to express to the country?
Censorship.
Elmwood Transcona.
I think what it says is that when someone is making accusations of Orwellianism, Canadians can't just take it at face value. They have to do their homework. I remember when the leader of the Conservative Party was at the cabinet table and the author of the so-called Fair Elections Act. Nothing more Orwellian than that, Madam Speaker. That was a bill designed to disenfranchise whole swaths of Canadians. And they called it the Fair Elections Act. And I think it's an act of psychological and political projection that the Conservative leader runs around talking about how other people are engaging in Orwellian language all the time. He read 1984 as a bloody guidebook. And so he imputes to everyone else that they're doing the same. But not everyone has done that. The Fair Elections Act is just one example. I would say my M79 is another, where the leader of the Conservatives has the opportunity to actually go after the Prime Minister's gatekeeping power and has refused to do it. So we do have to be wary of the use of Orwellian language in politics, but we can't take at face value from the Conservative leader when he accuses others of it. He should be looking in the mirror.
And comments? The honourable member for Nunavut.
And I'd like to thank my colleague, the member, for his great intervention. I completely understand what he says when he says not to take it at face value when it comes to this motion, because Conservatives have this history of making it seem like they do want to help, but they don't. And I have a specific example of when the Conservatives were in government in 2010. They made two cuts that were very important to Indigenous peoples, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation and funding to the Native Women's Association of Canada. This a time when Nunavut had a Conservative MP, and I wonder if you can explain why we must not trust this motion as it appears to be.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, I think Canadians should be suspicious anytime they see a motion that talks generally about government spending without actually having done the homework to identify the real waste. So yes, there is sometimes waste in government spending. We've seen our fair share of that. The ArriveCan app, the billions, tens of billions of dollars that have been shunted out the door to big consulting companies to do the work that properly belongs in the civil service and to pad the pockets of KPMG and others. There is waste in government. But a motion like this should be singling it out, because I think also of the massive investments in childcare that I ran on in 2015 and that New Democrats supported for a long time that are actually helping to make room in Canadians' household budgets. Because there's more than one way to tackle inflation, and in the NDP we believe the best way is to work collectively to lower the cost of things that Canadians can't do without, rather than simply cutting taxes when we know grocery stores and oil companies will gladly raise their prices to eat up that extra disposable income.
Question, the honourable member for Regina Louvain.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And oh, that was a tall tale my friend from Elmwood Transcona just told the people of Canada today, acting like him and his NDP party has no responsibility for what happened in Canada over the last 2 years, Madam Speaker. You realize how it...
Remind members that once I've recognized an individual, that doesn't allow them to ask questions or make comments. If they wish to ask questions or comments, they should wait to the appropriate time. A brief question, the honourable member for Regina Louvain.
To explain how they have no responsibility for the inflation in grocery prices as they vote with the Liberal Party 95% of the time. How they have no responsibility for interest rates going up so people can't afford their homes. How they have no responsibility for mortgage rates going up so they can't afford their homes. Rental rates going up so they can't afford their homes. It's so funny that they want to say that, oh, we have the answers, but the only answer they have is playing lapdog to the Liberals and keeping the Prime Minister in power. It's pathetic.
Honourable member Elmwood Transcona, a brief answer.
Well, folks in the Whip's office may be concerned that he didn't quite get his speaking notes right, because actually Conservative MPs for a long time now have been saying it's been an NDP Liberal government for 8 years, which is palpably untrue, and I think speaks to the fact that the Conservatives are not interested in getting to the truth. They're interested in getting into office, and they're prepared to say whatever it takes to get them there. Beware, Canada, because when they get there, it ain't going to be what they're telling you it's going to be.